Welcome to Wadsworth History on Film, a program presented by the Wadsworth Area Historical Society and designed to give us the oral history of Wadsworth. I'm your host, Cesar Carino, and today our guest is Dick Curtis. Now, Dick's real name is Richard, but no one in Wadsworth has ever called you Richard. And as a matter of fact, I'm so glad that I got to see you today, because I thought that you were born with one of those tapes around your, that you used to measure people at Curtis Menswear. Dick, you're not living in Wadsworth right now. Where are you living?
In Largo, Florida.
Largo, Florida. And the reason that you're here is that you came to visit your daughter, Marilyn Opplinger.
And we had our 8th great-grandchild while we were here.
And you had your 8th great-grandchild. Whose child was it?
It was Roger. I should say Robert.
Robert.
Opplinger. That's Roger and Marilyn's boy.
And Robert had a son, and the 8th one of the great-grandchildren.
Great-granddaughter.
Great-granddaughter. Well, the very, very best. And the day after, when was that child born, Dick?
2 mornings ago at 6:10.
2 mornings ago at 6:10. When she sees this program, when she's a young lady, she'll know that her grandfather came to be here. Her great-grandfather came to be here for that experience. Dick, you have a long history in the city of Wadsworth, and it was only by happenstance that we knew that you were in town. And the second that we knew that you were in town, we asked you to come up immediately so that we could interview you, because you're going to be going back to Florida in about a month or so. Is that correct?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, we needed to hear all about Dick Curtis. Everyone knows Dick Curtis from Curtis Menswear, but there's an awful lot that goes on before Curtis Menswear ever came into being. Your father, your grandfather, before him, all had significant parts in the history of Wadsworth. Let's start with your grandfather's Curtises, I guess great-grandfathers as well, and tell us some of those things that are so very important to the history of Wadsworth, Dick.
Well, it started in 1632 in Nassing, England, and they were making arrangements to come to America. It took till 1635, and they arrived on the James in Connecticut. Subsequently, they worked their way through New York and so forth to Wadsworth, Ohio. And part of the Western Reserve.
Part of the Western Reserve at that time.
Right.
And how did they come to Wadsworth, and when? Do you remember?
Some connections brought them here, of which I'm not sure. But they located on a farm adjoining the Huntsberger farm.
That was the Richard Huntsberger, or the
That's
Dick?
Frank Huntsberger.
Frank Huntsberger.
Known as Dick.
Dick Huntsberger, right.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And his father's name was Ephraim.
Right, he was a Mennonite minister.
Mennonite minister.
As his father before him was.
I see. And where was the farm where you and where your ancestors and Dick Huntsberger's ancestors located?
It would be in the vicinity of where the colony is today.
Where the colony is. In other words, across from the AC field.
That's right.
And just west of what is now Isham School.
That's correct.
Perhaps 1,000 feet, if that.
Probably.
Right in that area. And who lived where? Did the Huntsbergers live west of you, or did you live west of the Huntsbergers?
Well, of course, I was not a party to living there, and I don't recall which was which, but their farms adjoined. And they had trouble communicating.
Why was that?
The Huntsbergers spoke only Pennsylvania Dutch,
which was
the
German.
Curtises spoke Connecticut Yankee.
Okay. Well,
it took them several months to learn to speak to each other.
Well, the Pennsylvania Dutch is a German dialect.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And the Connecticut Yankee is still difficult for those of us who are not Connecticut Yankees to understand. So they did have some difficulties, but they got along well.
They worked it out. They learned to speak to each other.
Now, the people in your family, and I'll keep on saying your family because we want to go back that far, were not Mennonites, though, were they?
My mother was.
Your mother was a Mennonite?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And your father?
He went along with her, but he was not originally.
In other words, the relationship that you had with the Huntsbergers then was not only a neighborhood relationship, but also a religious relationship.
At that time, yes.
Because Dick's father, Ephraim Huntsberger, was the first Mennonite minister, is that correct?
I think that's correct.
Of the Mennonite church in Wadsworth, which at that time is where the Episcopal church is now, on the corner of Pardee and College.
Yes.
The big white church.
But that friendship, starting back there, lasted over 50 years between Dick and my father.
Between Dick and your father.
Right.
Was your father about the same age as Dick?
He was a little bit younger.
So your father would be probably about 100, 10 or 115 or 20 now?
In that area, now.
Right now. Then you were born, and you have other siblings as well.
Yes.
And who are those siblings?
My children?
No, your siblings, the brothers and sisters.
I have 3 sisters.
And who are they?
One is living, her name is Mary Wise.
Mary Wise.
She's 93.
And where does she live?
She lives on Crestwood.
Okay.
In the area above the Akron Road.
Right, in the new area.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And who else is living?
That's the only...
Living one?
Yes.
And who are the other ones who are no longer living?
Well, Margaret was another sister, and Janet.
And Margaret married?
A.J. Jankowski.
A.J. Jankowski, who was on Woodland Avenue?
Yes.
And he was an engineer of sorts, was he not?
He was some kind of an executive at the injector company. Mm-hmm. He was an accountant by training.
Oh, accountant, okay.
And an office manager by getting into it.
By his
yes. The home he built there, he designed, and I heard you mention Al Seifert.
Al Seifert, right. Mm-hmm.
He designed his home.
Al did.
Yes. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it cost $10,000 in those days.
$10,000. You couldn't buy it now for $1 million, probably.
The land and the home.
That's absolutely incredible. That you couldn't buy a lot in Wadsworth now for $10,000.
And at that time, incidentally, an executive who made $10,000 was really a nabob.
Oh, yes. I'm sure that would be true. And Margaret married Jankowski,
yes.
And then your other sister, who was?
A.C. Fisher. He was a Railway Express.
And was that also on Woodland Avenue?
No, they lived out in the Westgate area.
In Westgate,
yeah.
A.C. Fisher. How old would those sisters be now?
Well, Mary is living 93. Margaret was 5 years younger, and Janet was 6 years younger.
6 years. Janet was 6 years younger. Yes. That makes you the baby of the family.
No, I'm sorry. Janet was the baby of the family.
Oh, okay. Then you're older than Janet.
Yes.
And you are now what?
84.
84. You really look good for an 84-year-old man. You do.
Well, thank you.
I can still remember when you were in the Curtis Menswear, and you're always nice and trim, always extremely cordial to people, and all business, but yet very, very warm and personable.
Well, that was a counseling center and a meeting place for a great many people.
Oh, everyone came down. As a matter of fact, Dick Huntsberger was there every day.
That was his everyday meeting place.
Every day. And Dick Huntsberger lived to be 104 years old.
Yes, he did.
Mm-hmm. Smoked cigars, but he didn't bother him.
One time he asked a doctor if he should quit smoking cigars, and the doctor asked him, "How long have you smoked?" And he told him 47 years, and he said, "Keep right on."
Keep right on doing it. Didn't make any difference. I think that was pretty sage advice. Dick, and before we get into you here, let's go back to grandparents again. You have some grandparents who did some extraordinary things here in Wadsworth. Tell us about your grandfather who had the first automobile in Wadsworth.
Well, his name was Richard Franklin, and they called him Dick. I was named after him. And he bought that first automobile from Andy Auble.
But his last name was not Curtis, though.
It was Weaver.
Weaver, on your mother's side.
He was my maternal grandfather.
Right. Mother's name was Weaver.
Yes.
Mother's first name was what?
My mother's name? Gertrude.
Gertrude Weaver Curtis.
Right.
Okay. Now then, her father was Mr. Weaver. Your grandfather Weaver's first name was what?
Well, they called him Dick. It was Richard.
Richard Weaver. Okay. And he bought the first Oldsmobile, or the first automobile in Wadsworth.
Right.
Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And it was a 1901
Oldsmobile.
1901.
It's steered with a stick instead of a wheel.
Oh, for heaven's sakes. And he bought it from Andy Auble.
Right.
Andy Auble lived out west of the town.
Yes.
On the corner of 57, or not, well, Wadsworth Road, but it used to be Road 57, right, and College Street. And he had a son, Roland Auble, who lived there also. Is that right?
It was my impression that Raleigh was a brother.
Brother. Okay, I'm sorry, you're right. Raleigh was the brother, but Andy Auble was the automobile agent.
Right.
What did they do with that first car? I mean, it was a real novelty, obviously, to have something like that.
Well, they took people for rides. At one time, Captain Bates
The big fellow from Seville?
Yes. It
8
was he
feet tall?
7'1" or 8 foot tall.
8 feet 1 or 2.
They took him for a ride, and he filled up almost the whole carriage.
I can imagine he would. I'm surprised that the car held him.
Now, another thing my granddad did was drive up on Monday mornings to his waterworks to get
Where was that?
That was up on High Street.
On High Street. Tell us exactly.
Somewhere around the back of the Trump home.
And where was the Trump home on High Street?
Across from North Street.
Across from North Street. Okay.
In that general area.
All right. And the Trump home was right there. And the significance of that is that it's at a high place. Is that right?
Well, they had a well there and a pond, and they had a water supply. And it was Granddad's desire to furnish water to every home in town.
And how did he do that? Did he have pipes going there?
They had pipes that were made out of wood.
Out of wood. How did they make those pipes? Square pipes out of wood. How did they do that?
That I don't know.
Many years ago, I think in 1947 or about 47, they were digging out in front of what is now City Hall, or what was the City Hall, but at that time it was the Big W Market up there, if you remember that.
I remember that.
That Big W Market. And they came up with some of these wooden pipes, and I think they probably threw them away. What a pity, because we could have had some of those around, but I'm sure that someone has some of those wooden pipes around. Now, this was way up there at what is now in Highland Heights, is that correct?
I don't think it was that far up.
Not really?
I don't believe so.
Okay, well, maybe I'm a little mistaken then. How did the water get down into the town?
They had pumps.
They had pumps.
And that's what Granddad did on Monday mornings, get up there early to get the pumps going so the women would have enough water
to wash, because people washed on Monday morning. And that was it. They didn't wash during the week. They washed only on Monday.
That was usually the thing.
Monday was wash day. Now, do you remember, were you old enough to be with Grandfather Weaver?
Oh, yes.
And do you remember the waterworks up there?
No, that I do not remember, because he sold that in 1905.
To whom?
To the Wadsworth Light and
Power,
or water, light and water.
Okay, and they sold it, and then the city became part of that.
Eventually, yes.
But before that was privately owned in 1905. Do you remember anything else about Grandpa Weaver?
Oh, indeed. He started the telephone company.
The telephone company in Wadsworth?
In 1895.
Wow, 1895.
And it was called the Home Phone Telephone Company.
Home Phone.
And he sold that in 1905 also.
To whom?
To the Star Telephone Company.
Which then finally became Northern Ohio Telephone Company, NOTC.
And then GTE.
Then GTE, which is presently we have right now. Do you remember anything at all about the telephones in those days?
Not a whole lot.
Do you remember his stories about the telephones?
Well, of course, Winnie Dakin was a famous local character.
And tell us about Winnie Dakin.
She was the night operator. And, of course, the operator had to plug the phones in to make connections with. And Winnie became really well known. Everyone would call her by name and say, Winnie, get me so-and-so.
Such and such, and she would know exactly where to plug that in. Where was the office? Do you remember that, Dick?
I don't remember. It ended up on High Street, you know.
Wasn't it up there on above one of the stores, right close to the square?
Yes,
upstairs?
Eventually. I presume maybe it started there.
Probably so. Where was it when Grandpa Weaver had it?
No, I cannot tell you.
And do you have any idea how many telephones there were at that time?
Not very many to begin with.
Do you remember your first telephone?
Yes.
And what did it look like, and where did you have it in your house?
Well, it was on the wall, and you had to take it off the hook and call the operator.
Call the operator. Did you have to dial the operator?
No, the operator did all that.
She did that. In other words, you would pick up the telephone, and the operator would say what?
Number, please.
Number, please. And that would be Winnie Dakin many times at night.
At night it would, yes.
And during the day, who might have been on the switchboard at that time? Do you remember those names?
Well, there was a lady later on, Gersten Slager, who married a Dutt.
Which Dutt did she marry?
Al Dutt.
Al Dutt. Al Dutt had two children.
That's right.
Alfred Dutt and Roger Dutt.
Right.
And Mrs. Gertchen Slager Dutt What was her first name? Do you remember?
I think it was Ruth.
Ruth Gertzenslager Dutt was one of the telephone operators.
Yes.
And what did she do as a telephone operator?
Well, the same operation. She'd say number please, and you'd give the number and she'd connect you.
Do you remember any of the numbers in Wadsworth?
Well, our store number was 1053.
1053. Alan Hartzell was 8.
I believe it was.
Carburetor and ignition was 86.
Right.
Chupa's grocery store was 2204. Overholt and Freeborn was 41 or 42. They had 2 telephones.
Some of those sound familiar, but I couldn't have called them out like you did.
Well, I just happen to remember those. Of course, I've been doing this now for the past 3 months, that is, interviewing people, and so many people tell me things that I didn't know, and I'm able to. But many of them I remember from my own boyhood days, because when we were growing up, there weren't very many people in Wadsworth. When you were growing up in Wadsworth, now you're 84 years old.
Yes.
So that means that you're born in 1913. Is that correct? Do you remember approximately how many people were in Wadsworth?
It was around 4,000 to 5,000. In the downtown square, there was a huge watering trough for horses.
Let's hear about the watering trough.
And also hitching posts to tie horses up to. And most of the time, there were benches in front of the stores to sit on.
And why did they have those benches there?
Well, shopping was a social event at that time.
And Saturday night was the social
People used
time.
to come to town, and it was a social event, and then they'd shop also. Mm-hmm. And there used to be band concerts on those nights.
In the bandstand.
Right.
Right on the square. Mm-hmm. And where was the watering trough, and what was that?
It was on the east side of the park, or the open area.
Of the square, as it were.
Of the square.
But it was on the west side of the what they now call the Broad Street Park, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And the watering trough had a continuous flow of water in it, did it not? And if it got too full, it would kind of flow away and be sent out. Now, how did that water get there? I mean, did they pump it there?
They had a pipe. I was not a part of doing any of it. I was a little young. But some of the older boys would get a little boisterous sometimes and throw one of them in there.
They throw one of them in there. And I guess nature, or rather human nature, is always everywhere the same. They did the same things then as they do now, but they didn't have the newspapers to tell us about it or television. So we probably didn't know all of those bad things that happened. Horses actually drank there, is that correct?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Because in 1913, there might have been some cars, but there weren't a lot of cars.
There were not very many.
And you remember the horses going up and down.
Oh, yes.
Do you remember what Main Street looked like in 1913, right there where your store was?
Yes, I do. And that open square was a location for a lot of political candidates to come and orate.
Do you remember who some of those were?
I do not remember them, but I remember being there. They would get a large platform in the center of the square, and people would surround it, and they would speak.
And they probably didn't have microphones particularly. They would have to, you'd use their own voices to be good and strong. Do you remember anything at all about the mayor of the town when you were growing up? Say, for instance, as your first mayor, who was your first mayor that you remember?
Robert Stevenson was the first one I remember.
And then he was followed by?
And there was a man named, well, that slips me. I can't recall too many of those.
They might come a little bit later on. Let's go to your store for a little bit. Before you became involved with your store, you went to Wadsworth High School, is that correct?
Yes.
And you started in Wadsworth High School. Actually, you started in Wadsworth, the building that was through which you went all 12 grades, is that correct?
What used to be the central school.
Yes, and you went all 12 grades there.
I went to Lincoln School one year because at that time they had A section and B section.
And A section would start in September.
Yes.
B section would start in
And when I was in the 5th grade, they wanted to change that. So they moved some ahead and kept some. And I was moved to Lincoln School for 1 year, and I gained a half a year.
You gained a half a year. And Lincoln was probably just built then, was it not?
It wasn't too old. Lottie Mills was the principal.
Lottie Mills. And
long time
Oh,
there.
yes. And she was a stern, straight person with a bun in her hair. And not too terribly much in the way of messing around.
No.
None,
No,
as a
indeed.
matter of fact. She was the old school marm of the
That's
first
right.
water. Who was your first grade teacher, Dick?
Miss Hausman.
Do you remember her?
Oh, yes, very well.
And how about your second grade teacher?
Come up to third grade was Graham.
Mrs. Graham.
She also was a fifth grade, sister was a fifth grade teacher.
And her name was what?
Fifth grade was Graham, same as the third grade.
And you didn't know first names in those days, did you?
Oh, no, Miss.
Miss? What's your first name? My first name is Miss. And there were almost no misses, were there?
Not many.
Then you went from there and you went to Lincoln School for a little while.
For a year, and then came back to
Do you remember
Central.
who that teacher was, Dick?
No, I don't.
Went there, then you went back to Central School.
Right.
Who was the principal of Central School at the time?
One I remember was Swearingen.
Mr. Swearingen.
And Avery.
Mr. Avery.
And then later, of course, came Close. And,
Frank Close, but he wasn't there while you were there. No, he was there.
Well, he came there when I was a freshman.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, so then, in other words, in, let's see, in a freshman, you would have been, you were born what year? 1913. So you would have 1927. You would have been a freshman, is that correct?
Right.
1927, you would have been a freshman, and Frank Close came at that time.
Yes, and Mr. Mayhew was the principal.
Mr. Mayhew was
Clarkson
the principal.
J. Mayhew.
Clarkson.
Clarkson.
Oh, Clarkson J. Mayhew.
Yes.
Do you remember your algebra teacher?
No, I don't.
Could it have been a lady who lived right in the center of town?
I do not remember.
Don't remember it? Marguerite Straighton?
She was not my teacher.
She was
at
not
any
your
time.
teacher?
No.
She taught algebra at about that time.
Yes.
Maybe a little bit before then. Do you remember any of your teachers in the high school?
Well, Kenny Giffen had just arrived.
And he was a speech teacher.
Yes.
And Kenny Giffen went on then from teaching to become the president of the Citizens Bank.
That's
Is that
correct.
Yeah. A tremendous person.
Yes, he was.
Oh, just outstanding.
Just died not too long ago,
Not
a
too
year
long
and
ago.
something.
But he was such a good teacher, and
Yes,
everyone
he
loved
was.
him. Graduated from high school then probably in 1931. Or 1930. Graduated in 1930. Things were bad at those times, weren't they?
Yes, they
Very
were.
bad. I mean, we had just had the big crash in 1929, in October of 29, and you graduated about 8 months after that. Your illusions, your memories of what it was like right then.
Well, I was a freshman. No, I was a sophomore at Ohio University, and the bank failed, and about 12 checks came back. So I papered part of the wall with them.
You papered part of the wall with them. What did you do about the money?
Well, it had to be made up. My family at home made it up.
And what were you studying at Ohio University at that time?
In Commerce. School of Commerce.
Mm-hmm. And did you graduate from Ohio
I went
University?
3 years, and then I went to Akron Unite School 2 years.
To the evening college at the University
Yes.
of Akron.
You were associated with that, were you not?
I was the dean of the evening college at the
That's
University
right.
of Akron, but not then.
Not then.
Not then. The evening college at the University of Akron started in 1915. And it was designed specifically for people who needed to work during the day and then obviously come to school at night. You left Ohio University and came back to Wadsworth.
Right.
And you loved Wadsworth. You missed Wadsworth a great deal. Never wanted to move from Wadsworth. Is that correct?
Worked many years there.
Worked here all of your life. What did you do when you graduated from college?
Went back to work at
Where?
the store.
And who was at the store?
My father was a partner originally. Well, go back to 1882.
Okay.
Mr. E.J. Young, who became head of the injector, the match,
Right.
the box board, was a partner with Mr. Irie Everhard.
Ira.
Irie.
Irie?
Irie Everhard.
I-R-E-Y.
Right.
The reason I'm spelling these is that whoever writes our history 20 years from now will need
And
to know.
Mr. Young stayed 2 years as a partner, but it was too slow for him. He had bigger things in mind.
And he surely did.
He
started
certainly
big.
did. He was a neighbor of ours. One house separated us
And where was that?
on Broad Street.
On Broad Street. What number on Broad Street?
It was 177, our number.
So you're right close to the downtown.
Very close.
And he was right next door?
One house separated us.
One house separated us. On the north side of the road or the south side? Did you live on the north side of the road or the south side
The
of the road?
south side of the road.
South side of the road.
Yes. Mr. Young's home was where the Methodist church is
right
now.
now. He lived right there then.
Yes.
And you lived one house, which is probably where the gas station is now.
That's right.
Right there on the corner.
And the house that stood across from the streetcar track was Mabel Colby.
Mabel Colby. And tell us why Mabel Colby was significant in your life.
Well, she was not too significant in my life, but she was in a number of men's lives. She had what was known as a boarding house. But,
a boarding house.
We were too young to appreciate the fact that there might have been a little more there than that.
A little bit more than a boarding house there in Wadsworth. Well, I see. Well, I'm glad that you weren't. Well, you certainly wouldn't have been associated with that. You then went back to the store and started working there.
Yes.
And was it called Curtis Menswear at that time?
No, it was C.B. Curtis.
C.B. Curtis. Do you remember the sign on the outside of C.B. Curtis, what it looked like, how it was made?
It was glass, colored glass.
Colored glass.
With the letters in outline.
That's right, and it was somewhat of a...
block letters.
Block letters, yeah, but I'm trying to think of the word that, where you put glass in glass. I can't think of that word. It'll come to me. So we all have the same disease. It's
yes.
a three-letter word called age, and how I miss my mind because I forget some of these things. But
Now, how he became interested in that store, his father was a railroad telegrapher, Lamson Curtis.
Lamson Curtis was
And he was transferred to Ellis, Kansas. And he took his wife and 4 children to Kansas. And a strange thing happened there. He disappeared. Was never heard of.
Your father's father disappeared.
That's right.
Never heard from him since?
Never heard a word. So my father, being the oldest, brought the family back and became a substitute father.
In Wadsworth?
Yes. And he got a job as a custodian at the old normal school.
Which was on College Street.
Where the school building is now.
Where centralized and now Isham is.
Right.
Okay.
And that school, that normal school, just missed by that much becoming what is now Kent State.
That's right. That's right.
But Martin L. Davey was quite a prominent politician in Kent, and he maneuvered that.
He maneuvered it. The same identical thing happened with the second time that Kent State tried to come to Wadsworth. Right. We had a Representative Johnson from Orrville who evidently had a little bit more clout or whatever. We have no idea how that happened, and the University of Akron then got a branch in Orrville rather than the Kent State branch coming to Wadsworth.
So back to his job as a custodian. He wanted desperately to get a job in a store. In those days, that was a good job. Now it's a holding pattern for a better job.
I see.
But at that time it was considered very good. Mr. Huntsberger was a clerk in Dakin's dry goods store.
Now this is Dick Huntsberger.
Yeah.
In Dakin's. And where was Dakin's?
Just down from our clothing store, about 5 doors.
On the same side of the store?
Same side of the street.
What's there right? Same side of the street. Yeah. What is there right now, Dick?
Well, the Ben Franklin was there, but they moved, and I'm not certain what is there now.
They have a lot of different smaller things in there.
They were known, the clerks were known as counter jumpers in those days.
Counter jumpers?
And Dick was quite an active young fellow, and he worked for the Dakin Company, and he married Ethel Dakin.
He married?
Ethelyn Dakin.
Ethelyn Dakin.
Right.
And then...
But he and my dad were friends for 50 years. They associated together in business and socially.
Is that right? Mm-hmm. That was C.B. Curtis.
Yes.
Then C.B. Curtis, your father, owned that. C.B. stood for what?
The way he got into that, he wanted to get in the store. They kept telling him they didn't have a job. One Saturday afternoon, they were very busy, and he walked in and asked again. And one of the partners said, "Get busy." And
he did it.
He started to work.
There was no pre-employment investigation and Social Security numbers?
It made him a partner. It was Everhard, Rickard, and Curtis.
Which Everhard was this?
That was still Ivory.
Ivory Everhard.
And it was Dan Rickard.
Dan Rickard and Curtis. Then it became C.B. Curtis.
Yes.
C.B. stood for what?
Charles Blake.
Charles Blake Curtis, C.B. Curtis. I still can't think of the word that I want where you have glass upon glass and tile, but it'll come to us. But that's the way that looked, and that sign was out there for many, many years.
Long time.
How then did you become Curtis Menswear?
Well, my father became rather ill shortly after, in fact, about the time I came back from school.
Which was about 1932 or 3?
Yes, 33.
33. Mm-hmm.
And so I took it over. I bought out my 3 sisters' interests and took it on my own. My father, incidentally, had taken it over in 1911 from the partners.
Oh, he had it from 1911?
Yes.
I see. From the partners. Before we forget something here of great importance, let's go back to Grandfather Weaver just for another second and tell us how he and Andy Abel demonstrated the integrity of their first Oldsmobile.
They took it over to Akron U and drove it up the steps of Buchtel Hall.
And if you know the steps of Buchtel Hall, they're very steep, and there are a lot of
them. Right up there.
And no one stopped them?
No.
And did anyone view this? Did anyone witness this?
Well, I'm sure that a number of people saw that.
That's outstanding. We'll have to have that story given to the University of Akron for their archives. But in the meantime, something else happened with one of your relatives at the University of Akron. Tell us about that, too.
His name was Pitt Curtis, and he had a drugstore on Main Street on the east side.
In Wadsworth?
Yes.
Pitt Curtis, P-I-T-T.
Right, and on the opposite side of the street was a drugstore, Harper's.
Okay, where was Pitt Curtis's drugstore?
I don't know exactly how many doors down. It was about in the center of Main Street on the east side.
In other words, on the east side of the road on Main Street between the School Drive and Broad Street.
There was another drugstore later there, G&H.
G&H drugstore, okay, all right. Then
now, Mr. Huntsberger told me that in those days, 4th of July was a big holiday, and they shot a lot of Roman candles, and these 2 druggists would fire them across the street at each other. On occasions, they'd get a little spirited, and the local fire department would be on tap to put out any blazes.
Fire, I could imagine so. I'd be that's a lot of fun, I'm sure, but also a little bit on the dangerous side. But Pitt Curtis did what?
He was a druggist, and he had, in 1873, he and some others started the Wadsworth Savings and Trust.
Wadsworth Savings and Trust. Pitt Curtis was related to you how?
He would be my great uncle. He was my father's uncle.
Your father's uncle, okay. And he was living in Wadsworth too?
Yes.
Yes. He started the Wadsworth Savings and Trust. He was a druggist.
Right.
And then what did he do with the University of Akron?
Well, his only connection was the donation.
And he gave a donation for what?
Well, it was in memory of a son 9 years old who died, their only son. And that was a memoriam to, his name was Willie Lyman.
Willie Lyman
Curtis.
Curtis. And we then had at the University of Akron for years and years and years the Curtis Cottage, which was a classroom. And actually, Curtis College probably is still there. It's incorporated, obviously, with something else, but at one time, Curtis College was the mail room for the University of Akron.
Oh, yeah.
That's where the students got their mail and all of that kind of thing.
Now, 4th of July is a significant date in my memory of some anecdotes. The American Legion in the early 20s had carnivals or that sort of thing in the downtown. The square would be filled with tents and stands. And on one occasion, Mrs. Yulee Prince drove a Stearns Knight right through the country store that the American Legion had.
Okay, now Mrs. Yulee Prince was from Prince Keller and Kuhn Hardware.
That's right.
She was Floyd Prince's, not Floyd, but...
Floyd's mother.
Floyd's mother, but her father's name was, her husband's name was what?
Yulee.
No, her husband. Yulee's husband. Floyd's father's name.
Well, Mrs. Prince's husband's name was Yulee Prince in the hardware.
Oh, Yulee Prince was Floyd's father.
Prince's father.
Okay. And he had a...
They had bought a new Stearns Knight.
Stearns Knight was an automobile.
Yes. They made Stearns Knight and Willie's Knight, and it was a new engine design. It wouldn't collect carbon like some of the cars did.
I see.
This was a very nice car. I happened to see this accident. She hit the gas instead of the brake and went right through one of those big tents, full of pots, pans. It was a mess.
Oh, I would imagine so. Were there any people hurt?
A couple of people were scuffed a bit, but that's all.
What happened to the Stearns Knight car?
It didn't damage that very much.
Not at all. Now, they were a fairly large car, weren't
Yes, they were.
The Willys Knight was a smaller car.
Yes.
But the Stern Knight was a
big one.
This would have had to be somewhere in the 30s, right?
Yes.
Because the Stern's Knight quit making cars before 1935, I believe, did they not?
Yes. Another thing about 4th of July that I remember is the Griesmers, who lived across the street from us.
Which Griesmer? Sam?
Joe, George, Sam.
Joe, George, and Sam.
Ruth and Jane.
Ruth and Jane.
And the Parmeleys lived across from us down a ways.
Which Parley family?
Parmeley.
Which Parmeley family?
Well, it'd be Don Parmeley and Boyd Parmeley and
Kelly.
And Lillian. And on the 4th of July, we would all get together and mix up some sulfur and saltpeter and put it on the car tracks. It would make explosions, of course.
Of course it would. And that's what blew up the... Go ahead.
We got so good that we could make a pattern. It would go boom, 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 boom. And on some occasions, they'd get carried away and put too large a charge on. But the motorman learned to come in very slow.
This was on the streetcar tracks, right?
Yes. That car track came back of our home and came out the side of our home and down to the west side, the West Park, backed into the High Street Park and was ready to go back to Akron.
And it did that on a frequent basis, did it?
Oh, yes, every hour.
Every hour. That actually was then stopped in about 1934, was it not?
Somewhere in that area.
That was the Northern Ohio Traction Company,
yes.
NOTC.
NOTNL.
NOTNL, Traction and Line Company.
Possibly Light, would it be?
Light, the Northern Ohio Traction and Light Company.
I believe that's
it. That's right, exactly. And it ended in 1934, I believe. That's when they quit doing that. Go ahead.
Parmeleys had a pipe bomb.
They had a pipe bomb.
It's about that long. They'd stuff it with wet paper and black powder. And on one 4th of July, they had it all ready to go, and I was standing out where the light would be at Lyman and Broad.
Right.
And they were up quite a ways. But they fired this thing. They must have had a little extra charge in it, because I never knew what hit me. That thing hit me in the chest, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in bed at home.
Wow. Which Parmeley lit it?
Don and Boyd.
Don and Boyd did it.
Yeah.
Now, Boyd then spent a lot of time as the probation officer in Medina County.
Boyd did, yes, he did.
And he probably slapped the wrists of a lot of kids who did those kinds of things, don't you think? But the Parmeleys were very prominent in Wadsworth at that time. They still are around.
Don's the only one left in the family. In the family,
right. But I mean, they have a lot of their progeny. Some of the Parmeleys married some other Wadsworth prominent people. Who were they?
Well, Don married Irene Hall.
Yes, right.
And Boyd married a girl who was in my class in school, Mary Stonier.
Mary Stonier.
I got to tell you a story about Stoniers.
Okay.
Mrs. Stonier operated the jewelry store after William died.
That's
Bill.
right.
And one day, Lloyd Klein, who lived on High Street, they called him Red. Maybe you know the man.
I know Red Klein. I didn't know his name was Roy.
No, Lloyd.
I didn't know his name was Lloyd. I knew Red.
Red Klein. He worked at the post office, and also one time he was a custodian at Lutheran Church.
I see.
But this particular day, he came in with a package for me, and he was redder than usual. He looked like he was very upset, and I asked him, "What's the matter, Red?" He said, "I just came from around the corner," and he got into some kind of an altercation with Mrs. Stonier.
That was with Marion Stonier.
Marion Stonier, who's living yet up in the...
She's 99 years old.
Yes.
I wanted to interview her, but it was very difficult for us
Well, he said, "I just came from there," and he got into an argument with her. And he said, "You know, she ain't nothing but a damned old Republican anyway."
Well, what else would she want?
That was the rottenest thing he could think of to say about her.
She... Well, but what a wonderful woman this Marion Stonier was. And she kept on going with the store after Bill died.
She had a brother, Tony, who used to sit in the park at night and visit with Jimmy Jones and Cal Welker, who was Harv Gross's brother-in-law.
And now, what was her maiden name, Marion's maiden name? Bauman. And Jimmy Jones was the brother of Tommy Jones, who used to live in Silver Creek. And Jimmy Jones was, he used to drive a 37 Oldsmobile before he died. With a coupe.
Yeah.
He never married, did he?
I don't think so.
No, and he was kind of a person who sat at the park, a nice person.
They loved to sit there and visit at night.
A lot of people, you could go there on Sunday morning sometime, and they would just be sitting there talking with one another, and they would all be all dressed up in their cleanest overalls and, you know, scuff pants and things like that. Now, as you try to remember some of these things, and we want to hear a little bit more about the store, but before we go back to the store, there are some other neighbors on Broad Street there who were prominent in the history of Wadsworth. Name a couple more on Broad Street.
Well, Don Young lived across the street from where Wayne Young's home was.
Mm-hmm.
Later, he moved up on top of Broad Street.
Top of Broad Street, but when you say across the street, not across the street on...
From where the Methodist Church
right,
is now.
But it's on across East Street, though.
Broad Street.
Oh, I thought that...
On the north side of Broad Street.
Well, he lived on the north side. Which house? Where Keller lived?
Where Keller.
Okay,
Stanley Keller lived there.
Okay, we're right next to Sacred Heart School right now. That brick house. Okay.
And incidentally, right in that location, there's a huge culvert that goes from there clear across where the streetcar track used to be and comes out. And as kids, we used to play in there. And you couldn't get me to go in there with a gun now.
Well, just by coincidence, we were talking to Everett Perkins, or Perk. I've never called him Everett in my life. And he said that that exact same thing, that kids used to walk through there.
Yes.
And how dangerous that is. I'm afraid that if any kid sees this, if he doesn't know about it yet, he's going to be walking down through there. And we want to absolve ourselves of any guilt by saying it is not legal to walk in that.
Right.
Stay out. Don't ever do it. Don't ever go close to that place. But you used to walk in there.
Oh,
right?
Yes. There would be rats in there, and it was damp.
Oh, mercy.
Water dripping down was...
How high was it?
Well, it was high enough for kids to stand straight up and walk in there.
And how far did you walk?
From Broad Street, under the street, under the Young residence, and came out on the other side of the streetcar track.
Which was probably a distance of 1,000 feet?
Oh, at least.
Maybe even more.
Maybe more.
Where did it come out?
Well, it came out, there was a little creek ran down there, and that creek meandered down and came out on South Main Street.
On South Main Street, wow. And you used to walk that?
Yes.
Mercy sake. What year would that have been?
Oh, 1920s. Early 20s.
But you wouldn't do it today, would you?
Oh, not a chance.
Not even with a gun being pointed behind your back. Dick, I remember you so fondly every single time. As a matter of fact, when I saw you today, I thought to myself, that can't be Dick Curtis because he doesn't have a tape measure around his neck. Was that part of your, I mean, did you go home? Did you go to sleep with the tape measure? Or?
Not really.
Not really. But that tape measure was always around your neck.
Well, most of the time.
Mm-hmm. Used to have a suit club. Remember that?
Yes.
Tell us how that happened and how much it cost and how people...
Well, people paid $1 a week for
a suit.
For 25 weeks.
I was going to say, now, tell us how many weeks at $1 a week it would cost to buy a suit. How much?
Well, you could almost buy one at that time for that price.
$25.
A little more, maybe. I'll tell you one. Years ago, we sold the county sheriff, Charlie Williams.
Charlie Williams.
A 4-piece suit. It was a double-breasted gray suit. It had a vest and 2 pair of trousers, $22.50.
$22.50.
The extra trousers were $4. That made it $18.50 and 4. So he wore that for a few years, and then he gave it to his son, Eldon. And he wore it a while.
It's incredible. You know what a suit costs today, Dick?
It's terrible. Some high-class numbers are $300 and some dollars.
300 isn't very high class even. That's not even high class. Yeah. I have a friend, I don't buy suits that cost $400 or $300 or $200, but I have a friend who won't buy a suit for less than $700. And
terrible.
The quality is absolutely nowhere compared to the quality that you used to have there.
Arrow shirts were $2, and people used to complain about them being too high in price.
Now they're $25 or so. I don't.
Yes.
My wife does all my buying, but
Forsham shoes, we sold them for $8.95, the regular ones, and the deluxe ones, which are the best they made, were $10.
now they spend $150 for a pair of tennis shoes. And what did you use you probably didn't even carry tennis shoes, did you?
No.
No, that was, as a matter of fact, in those days, they were not even...
Used only for sports events.
Right. No one wore tennis shoes except for... And they had no supports in them or anything like that. Dick, the tailor that you used to have in your shop, tell us about him. He's a colorful character. Just
Weintz the tailor?
Weintz the tailor.
Yeah, he had his own shop years before that. And then after the war, he was looking for a job, and we needed one, and he came in very handy.
Now tell us how he spelled his name and what his name really was.
Well, his name was Flaran, P-H-L-A-R-A-N.
P-H-L-A-R-A-N.
Flaran Weinsheimer.
Weinsheimer.
And his brother was the fire chief, Lank Weinsheimer.
Lank Weinsheimer was the fire chief. The Weinst was just a name that he...
Well, it was an abbreviation of the last name.
Of Weinsheimer. Where did he have a shop before he came to you?
In the next to the alley on College Street where the Myers building is.
College? Or I thought it was next to the Brennies there, didn't he? Oh, no, that was the other Taylor. What was his name? Trent Taylor's.
Oh, that's right.
Yes, that's right. Weintz the Tailor was on the...
College Street.
On College Street, that's right, exactly. Describe him a little bit.
Weintz?
Yes.
Well, when he was young, he was very athletic. He promoted and was a trainer in boxing. And he had some pretty good boys. They used to have a match shop gym. They had dances there, and they had boxing events. And Weintz was always interested in those. He developed some pretty good fighters. Russ Johnson was one of them.
Russ Johnson. Mm-hmm. Did he have a particular way that he sat?
Oh, yes. They all crossed their leg.
That Taylor's
crossed their leg and put the work right over their lap.
And that's the way Taylor sat?
Yes.
Did he sit on a chair, or did he sit on a bench, or where did he sit when he was in
Sat on a bench.
He sat on a bench. Mm-hmm.
Now, before that, back in the old days of Mr. Huntsberger and my dad's time, there was a tailor above our store. There was a long stairs up there, too. Emmett Liebert.
Emmett Liebert.
And his son Herb.
Herb Liebert was the township trustee at one time.
Yes, they worked together and made suits up there.
Is that right? Mm-hmm.
They would get cloth in from the Western Reserve Woolen Company. I remember many bolts coming in there. Mm-hmm. And they would shrink them, cold water, shrink that cloth. And then they would cut out
the suits,
vests, the coats, and the trousers.
Because sanforization was not a process.
And that only applies to cotton.
That applies only to cotton?
Yes.
So I didn't realize that. So they would have to shrink the
cold water shrunk.
And then they would make the suits after that. Homer Liebert was the township trustee. And
Herb Liebert.
I mean Herb Liebert. Homer Liebert was one of his sons.
Was Herb's son.
And then he had two other sons and a daughter, did he not?
No, he had two other daughters.
Two other daughters, Jane and who else?
Jane and she worked for Louis Wilson.
Lou Wilson, Jane.
Miracle was her married name.
What was her I can't think of it right now, but I know it.
I can't
know it either. And Mrs. Liebert. Well, Herb actually had a crippling disease, didn't he?
Yes, he did. Now, his first wife was a sister of Jerry Hall.
That's right. That's right. Jerry Hall was the mayor of town, and we're going to have his son as one of our guests later on, because he's the only living,
Jackson?
Jackson. Jackson will come in and talk to us about that. His first wife was Jerry Hall's sister.
Right.
And then, what was his second wife's name? It was Ines? Ines Liebert.
She was a nurse at the hospital.
Right. Ines Liebert, okay. Now, these were the ones who were upstairs from there. But after they left, and during the time that you were at that store, who was upstairs from you?
Well, later we abandoned the upstairs and worked halfway up the first floor.
That's right, and that's why I wanted to hear you say that instead of keeping the upstairs, when you went into your store, you went in on one level and then you went up to another level.
Yes.
And your shoe department was where?
At the rear of the store.
At the rear of the store, but it wasn't there from the beginning, though, was it? No. Your shoe department was at the rear, and then your suits and things of that were also on that landing. And then some below.
They were on the first floor.
First floor.
In racks on the first floor.
I thought some of them were on the second floor too. Maybe not?
No.
Okay, they were all on the first floor.
Right.
Who worked with you at the time that you were in the store besides Weinz the tailor?
Oh, at one time there was Earl Gottwald worked.
That's what I wanted to hear you say. Earl Gottwald was a haberdasher, wasn't he? And that's what he did for a living.
He came from Sun Rubber Company.
Right.
He wanted to get out of there, and we got together.
And Earl then became a mayor of Wadsworth.
That's right.
Earl's wife is one of my very favorites, Eileen. She's just a tremendous person. And I wanted to interview Earl, but Earl's not well enough to be interviewed.
His eyes are bad, I understand.
Well, he has some other health problems, and it's going to be difficult. If I can still do it, I want to, because he has a tremendous amount of history about Wadsworth. Tell us a little bit about Earl Gottwald and what he did then after that, while he was still mayor. Well,
he managed one of our stores. We had grew to 3 stores.
And one was mail, and the other one was?
A dress shop.
A dress shop.
And later we bought Herb Tubasing's
dry goods.
Junior department store.
Which was across the street from, well, catty-corner across the street from you.
Yes.
At Herb Tubasing, S-T-U-B-B-E-S-I-N-G, right?
T-U-B-B-E-S-I-N-G is correct.
That's right. And
Herb, H-W.
H-W Tubasing. And his wife's name was?
Can't tell you that.
She was a lovely person, too.
Yes.
They were both just wonderful, wonderful people.
She was a Gensimer.
Gensimer.
And he married her and took over that business.
The Gensimers had the business first.
Yes.
And her first name will come to me, but then Herb married her, and they took over the business, and then they both somewhat retired, not at an old age, but as they got older. Is that correct?
Right.
Then you bought the store.
I wanted to tell you about downtown. Years ago, there used to be a lot of characters. Now, people say there aren't as many now. There might not be, but smaller towns used to be more noticeable.
Right.
And there was one old-timer, a Civil War veteran, John Miller.
John Miller.
Pat Miller. He always wore a blue serge suit, and he wore a hat that was a little similar to a military hat. He'd walk around town, he had a handlebar mustache, talk to people. He used to tell a story about his athletic days back in Kilbuck, down around Worcester.
Down around Worcester.
He said that one day he started to jump across Kilbuck Creek. It was pretty wide. Halfway across, he saw he wasn't going to make it, and he turned in midair and came back.
He came back?
Now, if you believe that story, you were a friend of his. If you acted like there was any doubt about the authenticity of that, he didn't like you too well.
He didn't care for that too well. How old was he at the time that you remember him?
Oh, he was in the 80s, high 80s.
At that time?
Yeah.
So he was probably about 130 or 40 years old now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And you mentioned in one of your shows, I happened to catch part, Big Andy.
Big Andy from Russia.
And Bert Koppelberger.
Bert Koppelberger.
Now, I don't know if anyone mentioned this or not, but Bert was stage manager at the Opera House.
At Joe Bender's Opera House?
And that Opera House had 2 basement levels. It had one and another. And they used to have a little Tom's cabin, Uncle Tom's cabin there. Live cast, dogs. And the dogs would chase the people up this side of the stage, and they'd go around the back and come around again. They got double and triple duty out of the same dogs that way. But Bert was the stage manager at the Opera House.
Bert, tell us about Bert Koppelberger. I was able to tell one story about Bert, but he was a delightful, delightful person.
He was colorful.
Oh, he was. And with that goatee of his, he looked like Prince Albert, you know.
And my friend Mr. Huntsberger informed me in many of our conversations that Bert had a taste for the ladies.
He had a taste for the ladies. Well, he had a nice, very beautiful blue eyes, if you remember, and he probably...
You know, his house, now this is part of your history probably, but the woman who went on to marry John D. Rockefeller
was born in that house.
You remember that?
Well, I don't remember her being born there.
Well, no, but you remember the story.
I remember that story, right?
Yeah, that was interesting.
That certainly was. The richest man in the world at the time,
John D.
John D. Rockefeller, married a girl from Wadsworth.
Right.
Remember her name?
I was trying to think of it.
Well, it'll come to us here, I'm sure. Do you remember any other stories about Bert Koppelberg? Do you remember the one about the cane where he would have a bullet on the bottom side or a blank?
I heard you tell that one. I think that was probably true.
It was. I actually saw him do it.
In his day, he was an excellent carpenter.
Yes, he was.
Excellent.
He was an excellent carpenter. There's no question about it. He chewed mail pouch tobacco.
Yeah.
When I was working at the B&B store, he'd come over every day, and he would say, I said, well, good morning, Bert, how are you? And he would, in a falsetto voice, said, oh, my left lung's a little weak, but my right one's all right. You know, then he was a big tease.
That's right.
But I'll never forget the time that I was standing out in front of what is now, well, I don't know what it is now, but it was over Alton Freeborn and Abrams and Mansfield, the grocery store. And there was this very, very genteel little old lady there, and she probably, at that time, was probably only 60 or 70, but I was only a young lad, my teens. And Bert was standing there, and he was telling the story, and I knew exactly what was going to happen. And he had his cane up, and he said, and he wanted to make an emphasis, and he said, well, by golly, and then just this big explosion. It wasn't it was a big pop. This lady just jumped out of her skin. But I'm glad you mentioned Bert Koppelberger, because with a great affection we remember Bert Koppelberger.
Now, downtown, years ago, there was an unusual situation. There was Simcox and Dick hardware store, and the Main Street entrance was next to the bank. And it went back a ways, and then it went out on College Street. They had an entrance on both sides.
Oh, is that right?
It's very unusual.
Yeah, it is.
And then down the way, there was a building where a Greek restaurant. There were two men ran it, and they stayed at Bert Koppelberger's.
Oh, is that right?
He had a boarding house along with his other activities. And the one had come over and relieved the other, and they'd go back and sleep.
And they were open probably all day long and all evening long. Do you remember the name of the Greek restaurant?
I do not. Ted Fixler, Clarence Fixler, had a novelty store in there at one time, 5 and 10.
Where would that have been on College Street?
That was on Main Street.
Or on Main Street, okay.
Right next to our building.
Okay, all right.
On the north of our building.
All right.
And then south of us, there were a couple of characters, Pennsylvania Dutchman, Alnoff and Eddinoff.
Alnoff and Eddinoff, and they sold jewelry.
Jewelry.
And Alnoff was involved with musical instruments too, wasn't he?
He was a cornet player, and he directed the band, the town band at times.
The family lives now out on 261 east of, well, they did, east of Hartman Road.
Alnoff's family?
Well, the Nolfs, yes. That's
that's a little different branch.
Oh, it's a different branch?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, Eddinoff was a character. He was little and a feisty little Dutchman.
Was he?
And those walls were very thin. I'll have to tell you about that. When he would start to sneeze, he might sneeze 15 times. The wall was so thin we could hear him in our building. And we'd count them and say, well, he's got 2 more coming.
2 more to go.
But Eddie got a little mentally disturbed, and he used to drive downtown and forget where he parked his car.
Oh, dear.
And we'd have searching parties go out looking for his car.
What would this have been? When?
Oh, late 20s.
Late 20s.
Yeah.
Alnoff, however, was a very dignified person, was he not?
Oh, yes. He was quite pleasant and totally different from Eddie. Now, that building, I wanted to tell you about that. That was an alley. And the Lester family put a roof on it and 2 ends and made a building out of it.
The Lester family?
Lester.
Bill
Lester.
Bill Lester.
Bill Lester's wife was some relative of Sam Wilshaw, who had a saloon on College Street. And they came into quite a lot of money.
And they put they made
a building out of it.
What building was it when you were there?
Well, it was a shoe repair shop.
Okay, that's, in other words, the shoe repair shop
was Alnoff's and Eddie's jewelry store.
But that was an alley.
Yes.
And they just put something on the back and something on the front.
Made a building out of it.
That's why it's so narrow. Right. It's only about 10 feet.
It was an alley. Now,
10 feet at the most, I believe.
I wanted to tell you about that saloon.
Okay.
My father and Huntsberger, being great friends, they used to go across the street. There was various businesses there, starting with Lee Anderton many years ago, a Woods family, Zarl, Transu, Hartman's, all lunch counters and novelty stores.
Right, Zarles, remember.
And my dad in Huntsburg used to go over there, and they'd entertain the crowd by saying very nasty things about each other.
Oh, yes.
And one day a fella said to somebody in there, boy, he said, those fellas must hate each other. And he corrected him. He said, don't let them fool you.
They're the best of friends.
They've been friends for a long time.
Dick, you're not going to believe this, but we are well over our hour.
Are we?
And we're going to come back with you before you go back to Florida.
I got a story about the Dick Huntsberger in the saloon.
Okay, we'll start that the next time we come back. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hello, Wadsworth. Roger Polk from The Ultimate Game here to remind you to clear your calendar.